Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to yet another episode of A Piece of Cake with our brother, esteemed brother, in the right side corner or right of the screen. Please introduce yourself, young sir.
I am, of course, Abdurraheem Green. And you are, what's your name?
I'm known as Anthony Baker or
Tony.
Abdul Haqq Baker.
The Dr. T.
How are you today, Abdurraheem?
I'm okay, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, not too bad.
Today, Abdurraheem, we're going to continue with part 2 of identity. I think the feedback we were getting and the discussions that were held last week, I think were very good. And I feel that we need to unpack some elements even more so today and from a different perspective. Now, I read from a book last week, as you know, an excerpt from Dr. Hirani, and I want to refer to another excerpt, which I brought up in the doctor's lab, but I think it's something that sits very well and neatly with some of the elements that were being discussed last week. So, for example, here, the postmodern self that emerges after the removal of God is composed of 3 key components. A, the belief that I have authority over my inner feelings. B, the idea that I can only be authentic if I express my inner feelings openly. C, the notion that the notion is that society must confirm and validate my feelings and behavior based on my emotions, as I am not submitting to Allah and therefore require people to submit to my will. And then the final part here, again, and I'd like you to speak to these points if you're happy to. It is quite apparent in today's society that there is a growing social sensitivity toward criticizing individuals for their personal choices. Any attempt to express disapproval is not only seen as a critique of a certain behavior, but is also perceived as an attack on that person's right to self-expression. This phenomena is precisely what postmodernism represents, a paradigm shift that prioritizes individual feelings over revelation and reason, thereby granting centrality and authority to subjective experiences. What do you think of that? I think that's very accurate.
I think it is, but I think it's not that simple. I'd love to draw a line under everything and say it's very black and white. But to be honest, since last week's podcast that we did, I've been thinking about things a lot, and I do think and turn these things over in my head, and I mean, one of the interesting things is about subjective experience, and that just for me opens a whole a can of worms. I don't know if it's a can of worms, but it's a very interesting discussion around the nature of reality, and I think part of the problem is within myself, when I think a lot about how do we know, for example, that Islam is true? How do we know that there's a God? How do we know that the Quran is from Allah? How do we know Muhammad is a prophet? Or I suppose on a whole wider level, how do we know even what reality is? Obviously, there are things that are objective. There are things that pretty much every human being agrees on. And by and large, we use that objective reality, that all these things that we agree on, to make sense of the world around us and to come to a common point of discussion. But despite all of that, having said that, despite all of that, for me, the most convincing proof at the end of the day that Islam is true is my subjective experience of living my life as a Muslim, right? And there is nothing actually that I can think of that actually has such an impact on me in terms of my conviction and my iman as my subjective lived experience of being a Muslim. And more than anything else, that convinces me that, that's the right way. The thing is, obviously, I realize as a point of discussion, it's a non sequitur, because I can't, you have your subjective experience. I have, that's what it means, right? Everyone has their own subjective experience. But I've always, for years now, Abdul Haqq, bro, I've had this position when I discuss with Christians, a lot of the things that I say to Christians, real born again Christians, people who have, like seen the light and, been saved by Jesus. And of course, when you ask them, how do you know it's true? Most of them cite their subjective experience. Well, I believed in Jesus and it changed my life. Right. And what do you actually say to someone who says that? Because they have a lived experience of something dramatically changing in their life. They've accepted a particular belief system, and they have found that themselves personally, it is something dramatic and good and beneficial. Now, obviously, we can still have rational discussions with them. We can say to them that, well, everyone will claim the same thing. I will claim the same thing Islam did for me. It's not a real proof. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that that's how that person really genuinely feels, right? So I think that people's subjective experiences, we have to recognize, are extremely powerful. They are extremely powerful. They can't just be poo-pooed and ignored. And I was thinking about this a lot, bro, because we've had Ilyas on before, and when he was on, it's the first time I even heard the term gender dysphoria. I'd never heard of it before. He was the one schooling us and lecturing us and saying, no, this is a real thing. Some people really, really do have an issue, and they literally think they are men trapped in women's bodies or vice versa, right? So how do we deal with that? And then there is the other point that, and this is really, I want to finish on this, is that the other thing is that I feel that, no, two more points I want to make. The second thing is that we all want to be nice, right? Islam teaches us to be nice. We empathize with people. We want to be nice with people. We don't want to offend people. We don't want to upset people. But however, that failing to not offending people and upsetting people when they are clearly deluded about reality does not necessarily mean you're being nice to them in the end, right? There's something called tough love, right? And sometimes we all know it. You and me are parents. Every parent knows. And if you don't, your kids are going to end up being spoiled, horrible brats. Sometimes you have to be tough. My ultimate thing I want to say, however, goes back to what you said about the in a sense, the death of God. Obviously Allah is ever living. When we say the death of God, we mean that people don't care about God anymore, right? And so if you don't believe that there's a creator, what really this comes down to is everybody has made themselves God, because everything you described is as if a person is saying, I am God. My feelings are the most important, and you must submit yourself to my feelings, right? And you must bend, your will must bow down before my will and my feelings and my subjective experience. And I think that thing that you mentioned there is actually gives us a clue as to where we have to draw the line. Everyone can have their subjective experience, and that is fine. There's no way I can persuade you. I can try, but your subjective experience is going to be very real to you, and I fully appreciate that and understand it. But what you can't do is expect me to submit myself and to sequitur my experience and my behavior to your subjective reality. That is absolutely ridiculous, and it's contradictory. It's by definition, it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction in terms, because by doing that, you yourself are refusing to acknowledge my subjective experience, right? So it is literally like a train wreck. It's like a train with no brakes that is flipping, heading for a catastrophe, and there's only one way it can end up. It is a wreck, because if everyone is going to insists that everybody else submits themselves to their own subjective experiences, and everybody's subjective experiences are different. It doesn't take an Einstein to figure out that that's a path to chaos. Those are my thoughts on that lovely passage that you read, bro.
No, absolutely. And I think what you've done is basically furthered what I've just read, and I think underscored it very, very well. Wa alaikum salam to our brothers and sisters who've joined us and our guests. Greetings to you. I think you pointed to a verse as well with regards to that subjective experience, where Allah says, "Have you seen the one who has taken their desires as their ilah?" And Allah, seeing them as such, has left them astray. So I think that verse, the paraphrasing of that verse, encapsulates exactly what you're saying, and it also points to Abdurraheem as well. There's a moral compass that we all have or should have. However, that is within a wider context of society. So when the society is not leading in this moral direction, and individualism is what is being promoted, as we've seen aggressively over the last 2-3 decades or more, then that subjectivity becomes the be all and end all, and everyone's judged upon that. And you'll see where minorities have the predominant voice, the prevalent voice, because they're able to rally particular power structures or power, let's say caucuses that will endorse that. So that moral compass that's there is, I think it's way off at the moment. Not that I think, I know it's way off at the moment. And one of the things as well, Abdurraheem, this subjectivity comes around when the intellect has been raised to a level of an infinite position. Now, as you know, that term, the death of God, was stated by individuals not so long ago. We know that the death of God was a concept that was born out of post-enlightenment, when enlightenment came about and intellect was put to the fore. So what we're seeing now around the subjectivity that we're discussing is, we don't know, not you and me personally, not the Muslim personally, we don't know the purpose of our very being. And when an individual is lost in that very intrinsic requirement to know who we are and what we are, then we'll see the mess that we're seeing now. Now, as Muslims, we know that we've been created for nothing except to worship Allah. Allah told us that. He's not made mankind and jinn except for his worship. What does that look like? That's enshrouded in our deen, in the Quran and the prophetic sunnah. But then when we look at others, and we're talking even about those Muslims who are talking about in the same vocabulary as those who are saying that these other identities and subjectivities are allowed, they're speaking in that tone because they have digressed and divorced themselves from that very fundamental essence of the entirety of mankind, which is to worship Allah. Now, you mentioned the Christian, and we can look at those from the Abrahamic faiths, and they are not as far off with regards to where we are in identifying the need to worship Allah. But the fundamental error, or you could say divergence from them, is again at the core of what we believe, which is Tawheed, okay, which is likening the creation to the creator in Isa alayhi salam in that regard there. So whilst they may have that, it works for them, they've found Jesus, as they say, which again, as I said, we can challenge from the basics of monotheism. The moral compass, even in that instance, is shifted away from where it actually needs to be. And Islam, I'm not going to say Muslims in this instance, I'm going to say Islam provides that moral compass, unequivocally provides that moral compass. And it's for us as Muslims to understand those contexts in every day, in every era, in every society that we actually live in. And that's why I think, and then there is subjectivity there as well, Abdurraheem. But I come back to the point that that foundational aspect remains, that core foundational tenet that we as Muslims subscribe to. And that's why, if that's I think if that's enshrouded or enshrined within constitutions societally, we won't have the degree of subjectivity that we've got today, where we've got everyone moving like satellites in various directions. We're seeing so many ills come through society as a result of that. And society, at the helm of society, the leaders of society, are not providing that direction and that guidance. They're basically facilitating, I'd say, a cesspool of ideologies. And that's very harsh me saying that. Why do I say a cesspool? Because it's a mess, okay? And there's no direction. Everyone is, everything is about individualism. Everything is about the individual. There's nothing about the collective. And even, I've listened, as I mentioned to you beforehand, I've listened to a podcast, it's Poor Mental Health, the product of Poor Iman, and it's a really good discussion there. And the doctor was bringing so many particular aspects. But when we are not, I think when we do not have that moral compass, the religiosity, that spiritual aspect embedded in our core, or we are divorced from that core, then identity, who we are and what we represent, becomes very, very obscure, leading to the breakdown of society.
Well, I think it's very interesting because look, oops, sorry about that noise. Right now I'm reading this book. Yeah, so it's very interesting. Yeah, it's called Insight. Yeah, so it's basically, it's called, the title is called How to Succeed by Seeing Yourself Clearly. Right, and this is something that has fascinated me, and I've talked about it a lot in the other podcasts that I used to do. I don't know, I can't remember what it was called, but you know, when this whole when the Stream Islam started, I was doing a podcast, and what the topic that I was discussing, the thing that I was going through was different types of cognitive dissonance, or different ways in which your brain gets things wrong, because Allah has given us, which is amazing, He's given us all these shortcuts, these ways of looking at the world around us and coming to conclusions quickly, which sometimes we need to do, right? It's very important for our survival, because we couldn't think through every single thing every single time, right? It would just be too energy intensive. But then also the thing is, obviously these shortcuts can sometimes lead us to make mistakes when they're misapplied. But anyway, I just think it's important in that we need to study ourselves as human beings, right? And I think the key thing to do that, the real reason, ultimately, from the Muslim's perspective, is to achieve sincerity. Because in order to really be sincere about achieving sincerity, you have to be very, very honest about yourself. You have to be able to look at yourself internally, understand who you are, what you're really thinking. You have to dig behind all of those stories that you tell yourself. And I'm sure you got lots of stories, Abdul Haqq, about, you know, how you're black and you're mistreated and, you know, this and that. Like I have stories, by the way, about, you know, we all have stories, yeah? And well, they're fine. It's not a problem, right? It only becomes a problem when these stories become excuses for our wrong behavior, right? That's when it becomes a problem, right? They're not a problem. They're important for us, for our identity, yeah? But when these stories then become excuses for us not to do stuff, or we've done really bad stuff and we excuse ourselves because we tell ourselves these stories about, well, I'm this type of person, because this is when it becomes really problematic. And you move into the realm of being delusional. Now, I think this is, you know, as a general topic, I think it's the most important topic. And it is actually not the most important topic, but it's one of the most important things for us to do. And that's the heart of what, you know, tazkiyatul nafs is about. It's what really purifying your soul is about. It's just coming to terms with the reality of who you are. Now, what I found really interesting, I have only got through a little bit of this book, but you see, it goes back to what you started with, right? What I've realized is that, and I, you know, because this is not a religious book, this is written from the point of view of a, you know, a psychologist. And what is really interesting is we all need to understand that psychology is not value free. Science is not value free. They have their own particular secular outlook and ways of perceiving things. And that is that is also true, by the way, about therapy. Therapy, particularly the whole realm of therapy and psychology, is all looked at through a secular lens, right? And so, by the way, therefore, is the topic of mental health. The whole study of this is looked at through a secular lens. It is not value free. Do not think it is, right? And so, for it's not really scientific. It applies some aspects of the scientific methodology, but because it's not value free, it's not really scientific. So anyway, I'm just waffling on. But the main thing is that what I realized is that all of this searching for yourself and your real self and understanding yourself was all done so far through the lens of trying to find true happiness and fulfillment, right? Which is all well and good. But what if that itself is flawed? What if that lens of seeking happiness is flawed? So basically, if you're looking to understand yourself, but you're only really doing it to see how can I live a more happy, fulfilled life, instead of really trying to understand who are you, what is the reality of you, right? How are you going to get to the truth, right? And this is the problem. The problem is because they have not started from the point of view of understanding what is the nafs. Yeah, what is the aql? What is the human being? What reason do we exist for? Everything is going to be flawed. If you don't understand that you've been created to know Allah and to worship Him, and that is the actual reason you've been created, and whatever you do will be a failure unless you accomplish that. Everything that flows from it is, everything that flows from other than that is therefore going to be false and futile. Now, you might get a few things right, you might get a lot right, but ultimately, you're just going to miss the mark. And that is the fundamental problem. That is the fundamental problem.
And that's what
the fundamental problem, bro, is an existential one. They don't really know what is the actual purpose of human beings existing in the first place.
And you know,
and that's identity. That is the reality of identity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what you've said there is interesting. Coming back to that lecture that I was listening to, and it shows, as you said, that secular focus of these sciences. An individual was speaking. He mentioned that someone went to a psychologist and had, some have those issues with they will take too long making wudu because they're not sure if they've made it properly, to the extent that the waswas makes them miss the salah and everything. And so one of them went with that to his doctor or psychologist. And you know what the psychologist said? Non-Muslim psychologist. He said, stop praying and then this problem will go away. Yeah. And so the individual, the podcasters listening to saying, that's why you can't go to non-Muslim psychologists.
Well, I was dealing with someone with exactly this problem, right? And his mum was saying that his dad wanted to send him to a psychologist. I said, do not do that. Please do not do that. Let me deal with him. Let me help him. That is the worst thing that you could possibly do. But the fact that I even had to say that, the fact that this parent, Muslim parent, was even thinking of it, they're just clueless, bro. That's the problem. It's just complete. It's an aura of science and a completely, being completely clueless about the fact that these people are not value free. When you go to a therapist, they have their values, and their values are secular, materialistic values, not religious ones. And they will give you. This is why Allah says, "Do not take the disbelievers as your awliya, and they will not fail to corrupt you." Now, this ayah does not mean you have to hate them, right? No. Or whatever. It's just a simple truth from the perspective of a Muslim. Even if they love you, even if they genuinely love you and care about you and they only want best for you, their lens is distorted. The very lens through which they will try and express their love is going to be misguided. Yeah. When they try to help you, they will not go back to the Quran and Sunnah. They will not go back to the guidance of Allah and say, Allah says and the messenger says. They will say, well, Oprah Winfrey said, or Freud said, or, you know, Young said, or some other misguided, misguided person who is not enlightened with the guidance of Allah. That is why Allah says they will not fail to corrupt you. I don't know when the Muslims individually and politically are going to wake up and understand this truth. And it's true whether it's, you know, in your personal life, whether it's in your political life, whether it's in your economic life. We still see Muslim rulers running to the kuffar, seeking their help, seeking their, you know, they want them, they go to some kuffar consultation thing to help them organize their political life or write their laws or whatever it is, subhanAllah. Right.
And that's why coming to the construct societally, Abdurraheem, as Muslims, when we're looking at identity, and in my studies, I looked at, and there were more constructs, there were more classifications, but just for now, looking at society. Society provides services and ideologies to make the citizens law-abiding. In the academic terms, legitimize identity. Okay, so it's a bargain. So we give you things that you want, and you subscribe and you adhere to democratic ideals. But then there's a polar opposite to that when we see strikes, boycotts, and everything like that, because the society is not happy, or members of society are not happy with that contract or what has been provided. And we've seen that. We see that in France. We saw that in Hong Kong. And those identities that are polar opposite to the legitimized law-abiding ones are resistance identities, okay? Because they're resistance, but we no longer agree with this. It may be an aspect of society or something, a policy or fuel hikes or anything like that, but they're now in that resistance construct. My point here, Abdurraheem, why am I raising this from an identity perspective? Even though the majority of us as Muslims consider ourselves law-abiding in society, okay, because we adhere to the laws, we're not committing criminality, the greater extent of us are subscribing to the values that are conducive to the deen, to our deen. However, what is the perception of the society upon us? And why am I asking that question? Because you're seeing in some regards that we are placed in that resistant bracket by virtue of our belief, Abdurraheem, not our practice, appearance, and everything like that. And now I come to the point that I want to emphasize. So where do we place ourselves in that regard as it relates to identity? Because you've seen there are Muslims that have a very liberal perspective, to the extent that we're seeing adherence to our fundamental belief. So where do those Muslims place themselves? Do we accept that in some respects that we're in that resistant classification by virtue of being Muslim, by virtue of Tawheed, by virtue of adhering to the Sunnah? Or do we struggle and strive to say, well, we are law-abiding, which we are according to laws and everything like that, and we want to be seen by society in that law-abiding realm in every aspect, even if it means compromising, okay, or discarding fundamental aspects of our deen. I hope you're clear on what I'm saying there. So I've only given two.
I get what you're saying, but I get what you're saying, but I think you might be I think you might be presenting like a dilemma that's not necessarily there or doesn't need to be there, in the sense that at least theoretically, at least in theory, whether it is like this in practice is a different question, but at least in theory, Western society is supposed to be able to accommodate different political viewpoints, right? So you can have different political ideologies, and the prevailing ideology may be capitalism or a type of, semi-socialist capitalist, but you could have a communist ideology or conceivably some new ideology, political ideology, a totally new one that you could come up with. So there are there's supposed to be, at least in theory, the scope for different political ideologies. And I suppose you could even present Islam, or you wouldn't need to say it's Islam, but you could have as a political ideology everything that Islam teaches, just not call it Islam, whatever. But so at least in theory, you are supposed to be able to oppose the existing paradigm without being considered breaking the law, right? So I think that may not necessarily be a contradiction, because obviously the society recognizes that that reality, that that's what supposedly democracy is supposed to at least accommodate for. So yeah, that's one thing. So I think it's useful to be able to, as Muslims, I think we do need to wake up to that there is a difference between the ideology that is the so-called ideal that is propagated, and the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that actually Western society is very entrenched in a particular ideological position, and that if you don't toe the line to that, you are looked at as being resistant. And I think that, or I don't know, is that the term you used, being in a
resistant? Yeah, resistant identity.
Resistant. Yeah. And I think it's actually only the quicker Muslims wake up and realize, and this is what I've said this for years, bro. I've said this for years. I said it's ideological warfare. It's a warfare of ideology. I've been saying this for a long, long time, is that we don't necessarily have to have violent confrontation, but there is absolutely no doubt that there is an ideological confrontation, because the belief system, that what we believe in a society that is based around worshiping God and knowing the reality that we have been created to worship God, and that we should surrender and submit ourselves to his guidance, not to the whims and dictates of human beings, is diametrically opposed and completely different to the ideology is that we human beings can make it up and decide for ourselves what we want to do. It's a very, very different way of looking at the world. The sooner Muslims wake up to that, the better, and stop pretending it's otherwise.
The government themselves, as you know, even during the time of Cameron, have said the battle for hearts and minds. They've made it very clear that they're apparent, as you said, there's an ideological warfare. I think, as you said, we need to wake up to who we are and where we stand. And that doesn't mean, as you said, in violent opposition or confrontation. But the question is, why are we so disparate? 2 million, is it 2 million? Have 2 million Muslims in this society, if not more? Mm-hmm. Why are we so disconnected? Why are we unaware of who we are, even in the times where we're speaking about? I remember the arguments in the 90s about we should be able to have halal meat, and then we had the argument about Muslim schools. We've got the Muslim schools now. We've got various masajid that are there now. But as a caucus, we cannot come together where there are serious ideological challenges now at the moment. Really serious. Again, let's come back to it. Ones that are impacting our children. Ones that are impacted. I was sent a clip recently of parents in separate cases, excerpts of separate cases, where they'd gone and crashed assemblies or little events where drag queens were singing to the children, everything like that. And what amazed me, I suppose I shouldn't have been amazed, but I've been gone 20 years, as you know, on and off, was the whole audience who had gone and taken their kids there and everything like that, standing and heckling the parents in each case who had come to say, this is grooming, this is abuse. What are you doing to our children? Wake up. The point I'm making here, those were non-Muslim parents who were taking it on themselves. It hadn't made news media. When the Muslims stand up, it makes the front. But the point is, who are we collectively? Because Abdurraheem, if we know that, and that's visible and apparent collectively, surely that's a sum of all parts, and that comprises of everyone understanding who we are as Muslims, what our identity is. I'm not sure we do.
I think the thing is, bro, is that I mean, look, again, this is something I've been saying for years. The raw facts, are that Muslims came to this country to milk the cow. They came to the West, by and large, to benefit from the materialistic success, from free education, free healthcare, and to get jobs and become economically prosperous. Muslims, by and large, did not move to the UK thinking we need to give dawah to these people, we're going to invite them to Islam. It didn't happen like that, right? And I think again, Muslims have themselves a very secularized idea of what religion means as well. This is another problem, is that for them, they have this disjointed, we've become more and more like the Christians in the sense that we have this disjointed secular viewpoint about what religion means. So I think Muslims have got used to, and you can see that in their daily life, right? Which is probably not helped by the fact that, within certain schools of thought, you are allowed to sell haram things and take riba and so on and so forth, because it's the land of the non-Muslims, and the behaviors you're allowed to follow there are different. So you have this thing that Khalid Yassin used to talk about, the topi Muslim, is they come into the masjid, they pick up the topi in the topi box, put it on, and they're transformed into these pious angelic beings. They take the topi off, go to their shop where they're selling alcohol, cigarettes, and pornographic magazines, right? So they already have this extremely disjointed viewpoint of what it means to be religious, of what it means to be Muslim, of how you're supposed to live your life as a Muslim. And this whole idea that being Muslim extends into everything in your life, how you run your business, whether you cheat people, whether you're honest in your business or not, whether you sell haram or halal, right? And the same thing. Otherwise, so when it comes to their kids, when it comes to education, when it comes to even therapy, these type of things doesn't cross their mind, because they don't look at this as something that's anything to do with religion, because they have already this secularized viewpoint of what religion is. And that's where the problem comes from, bro. Right. So when it therefore comes to but there's some things which I guess it's just a line that they realize, wait a minute, we all know that being gay, not being gay, but practicing, homosexuality. But let's just say most Muslims believe that being gay is wrong. Let's just say, let's not get into the nitty gritty of, whether it's being gay or practicing or, what. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point comes down to the LGBT plus stuff is haram. It's not from Islam. It's against, and it's a big thing. It's a big haram. It's not a small thing. It's like a major, major departure from, how Muslims should be. They know that. Just like you shouldn't have girlfriends, just like you shouldn't drink alcohol, just like there's various things. We all know there's certain things we all know as haram. So I think this is highlighted for them, right? Something that until now they have not woken up to. It's actually woken them up to the fact that no, this comfortable separation between our religious life and just the normal life that we just get on with is just not comfortable anymore. Now we realize that there's something else going on. There's an agenda, there's an ideology, right? And I guess many Muslims maybe looked at the world around them, university and science, and they thought they allowed themselves to believe that it was value neutral, right? It didn't have values. It wasn't, and often we use this terminology, bro. They have no values. They have no morals. It's not true. The West does have values. They're just different from ours, right? They do have morals, right? We may not agree with them, but they have their ideas of how things should be and what they think is right and that what is wrong, right? And they have their secular values, which is imbibed into everything.
Right.
So I think the Muslims, secularism is not value neutral. It's not. This is the reality. So maybe Muslims are waking up to this. Maybe the whole LGBT thing plus is like a red line for them, which is now maybe beginning to wake them up and make them understand that, you know, we've been fooling ourselves all of this time, and that our, you know, our trust and naivety has been misplaced. So who knows? Who knows where it will lead? You know, and I think we're not the only ones, bro. I think Christians, by and large, have also, you know, been duped into it, right? They've also
Absolutely.
allowed themselves to sort of just mosey along and just whatever, and thought it doesn't matter because it's value neutral. But so it's not, we're not the only ones, I think,
That's why it
that have
comes
been
back.
caught
No,
up in this.
absolutely, Abdurraheem, and I appreciate what you said and acknowledge what you said there. That's why I brought that societal framework first and foremost, because what we're seeing is that if there's a fascist liberalism that's taking place, that if you do not abide by or adhere to relatively new belief systems that are being imposed,
Yeah.
by virtue of your rejection of them or resistance to them or non-adherence to them, you are deemed by society, by the state, as
Yeah.
a resistant identity. You are no longer a legitimized law-abiding identity. And I think that it's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
important,
Yeah.
really important that this is understood, because as you said, it
Yeah.
goes into that sleepwalking, thinking that you're perceived one particular way, when in actuality, by your adherence to your religion, by default you've been moved into another identity construct which you may not consider yourself to be in,
Mm.
until the state starts challenging you or highlighting particular aspects of your belief to
I
show
think a
you.
lot of this, by the way, a lot of people were woken up. Well, a lot of people weren't, unfortunately, but lots of individuals were woken up with the whole war on terror and the demonization of Muslims. And, you know, lots of Muslims have suffered personally, being stopped, being interrogated, being questioned, you know, being held at the airport. And people who just going on holiday to Mallorca or to Turkey or to, you know, whatever, just incomprehensible to them, you know, that for them, they just thought we're just ordinary people getting on with our life. Yeah. And suddenly they're subjected to all this. I saw this with the elite, some of the elite in Dubai. They just woke up. They just, you know, they were shocked at the way they were treated. And these are people with lots of money, right? These are people who come to London and spend millions, right? And yet they were so disgusted at the way they were treated. They couldn't believe it. It was a big wake up call for them. And I think that was one thing. There has been this sort of gradual, but unfortunately, the reaction of the wider Muslim community to somebody who is targeted is to ignore them and keep away from them and
Right,
actually boycott them and
right,
distance them, as if,
yeah.
you know, there's no smoke without fire.
Or to believe,
Um,
and to believe the propaganda that's been put out by the
and to
media.
believe the propaganda,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah.
right.
So there is this, and it's this quietism, it's this, you know, it's this, you know what it is, bro. It's a particular cultural servile, you know, mentality, right? There is amongst some cultures an extremely servile, you know,
Post-colonial.
yeah. I don't know. Yeah, you know more about it than me, right? But there is this mentality, right? But alhamdulillah, I think it's changing. A lot of people are woken up. A lot of people, you know, the more people have been affected, and I think this whole LGBTQ plus thing is another massive wake up call. Like I said, it sort of seems to be, you know, I've been on groups and people are saying, oh, why there's so many terrible things are happening. Yeah. There's Yemen and there's Palestine and there's this and there's that and there's the Uyghurs and there's all of these things. And how come the Muslims, you know, they're only making a fuss about this? Well, you know, because this is in your face. They're dealing with this, you know, this is shocking to them, right? This is like a line that who knows what it is that is the thing. They may be aware of these things in the back of their head, right? But it's not happening to my kids, right? That's not happening to my children, right? My children are not in concentration camps. My kids are not being bombed in Yemen or whatever it may be. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Okay, but my kids are being forced to listen to this LGBT propaganda and said it's okay to be gay. And, you know, if you even try and tell your kids that it's not okay, you can be in problem, right? And it's like, what the hell is this? They realized, right? And the thing is, obviously, because I guess deep down Muslims know religion is about morals, it is about values, it's about halal and haram. Like, even the question, what does religious freedom mean? If I'm not free to follow the values and the morals and the teachings of my religion, what do you mean by religious freedom? Right? I'm only free, what, just to pray and to fast? The whole point of religion is to give you a set of rules and morals and values to live by. That's what religion is about. The prayer helps you to live according to those values. The fasting helps you to control your impulses so you can live according to those values. That's the value of it. That's the benefit of it. So this is ultimately, like you said, bro, this is the resistance. This is the whole thing. It's like, even when they mean freedom of the religion, well, what does that mean?
Well, they don't. Because to add to what you're saying,
it doesn't really mean anything, does it?
Exactly. Really, we saw again the government, conservative government, again previously subscribing to an ideology that they wanted to see prevalent across the UK. I couldn't believe that one, because
the conservative, like, what does it even mean anymore?
They said they wanted Sufism. They would like to see Sufism as a practice, and we saw them elevating particular so-called former extremists because of their drive towards Sufism, because it fit with the secular model. You practice Islam in the confines of your home, and it should be restricted to that. That's how the church, as you know, Abdurraheem, became. Yeah,
but even Sufism doesn't subscribe to that, bro. They don't even understand.
Well, I know, I agree. But the point is, they thought that was the most, let's say, suitable model that aligned with what happened when we saw the church and the state split centuries ago, and we see where we are today in the UK. They wanted to see an equivalent of that with Muslim Britain. And the fact that they were driving for that, again, that's why I'm bringing that point to the fore, that when we're holding that, we are legitimized identities, law-abiding citizens and everything. Yes, we are. By and large, we are. But we're not always being viewed in that way by the state. Okay. Again, and we'll draw to a conclusion on this, Abdurraheem. For all of us, we looked at the point here that we saw discrimination and because of the naming your children Muslim names. And I come back and I say to myself, and this is a rhetorical question, did the Dal Harb individuals get it right when their children were born and they gave them non-Muslim names because they didn't want their identities as Muslims to be known as they grew up? We knew individuals who did.
Well,
that.
I think the reasons are different, right? Isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, the reasons are different.
Yeah. So we're seeing discrimination. We're finding out retrospectively that discrimination is there if you have a Muslim name. If your name is Fatima, if your name is Muhammad, and you go through your CV, resumes put through, we've seen examples of showing that discrimination that is there. That's societal discrimination, Abdurraheem. So we have to consider, again, the title's there, who and what we are. What is front and center of our identity? And
well, bro, it goes back to, look, I think it's a good place to finish because we've had some pretty deep discussions here. But you know what? It goes back to something I've been harking on about for a long time, right? And I sort of touched upon this already. And I think that one of the big cures for this, for the Muslim community, is if we have a dawah mentality. In other words, if we live here and think as du'at, as people who are inviting the non-Muslims to Islam, and that becomes our meta program, that becomes our overriding, intention, and that therefore becomes the basis of our thinking and therefore our actions, we will find that not only ourselves, but our children, our identity will be much, much more positive and solid and proactive, which I don't think it is at the moment. And I think that this fact that we don't have this dawah mindset, we don't look at ourselves as people here who are here to invite them to Islam, it would be a massive paradigm shift if the Muslim community at large thought themselves as primarily our biggest duty here is to give dawah, is to invite these people to Islam. It would just be such a massive shift in everything we do and the whole way we behave as a Muslim community, and a positive shift in the right direction. And I actually think we'd be taken a lot more seriously as well. Anyway, that's my final thought, bro. It's been a super deep, involved conversation, one of our deepest, I think, mashallah, I would say. It's been, I don't know if anyone's been following it and with us all the way, because there's a lot of stuff to cover.
if what we should then do is to sort of like soften that intensity. If we are going to do a part 3, let's start looking at some practical solutions, some of which are in play maybe regionally or have been done historically, on how we can galvanize ourselves as a Muslim community here.
So it would be like how do we re-establish and reaffirm our Muslim identity? Yeah. So it's identity, but through the lens of what are the solutions? How do we re-establish our identity? What things can we do to re-establish our identity and solidify it in a positive way,
individually and collectively? Yeah, I agree. I think that we need to look at that. A lot of things are out there already, so why aren't they working? What can we do to regenerate, galvanize? We need to look at it, because our identities are being submerged by an ideology that is prevalent at the moment.
Well, we've got quite a few yeses, and if people are, because I need to start thinking about it now.
Absolutely.
You know, I've already said one thing, but I need to think of some other things, because there's lots of different things. But anyway, bro, I think like my brain is pretty sizzled now, because it's been fully engaged, and I'm exhausted. I felt like I've done a afternoon of Speaker's Corner here, bro. This has been, I think my brain's been stretched so much for a long time, but you know, it's been brilliant, bro. Dr. Baker, as usual, mashallah, jazakallah khair. For heading this discussion. You always start with a gem, and mashallah, it goes on from there. And for all our listeners as well, thanks for joining us, for all your comments. Inshallah, we will do a part 3 next week. Is that right, Dr. Baker?
That's right, inshallah. Hassan thinks that's the way to go. We will go with that next week, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair, everyone, and Abdurraheem for the stimulating thoughts, because I'm going to have an early night tonight, because I'm exhausted after this. But inshallah, next week, part 3. Look forward to seeing you all then, inshallah.
All right, guys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.